and welcome to this evening's special Tokyo International University Global Dialogue panel on the subject of doing IR differently, that is being co-hosted with the Institute for Social Science, the Social Science Research Institute at the International Christian University here in Tokyo, Japan. I am Chris Lamont, an associate professor and assistant dean of international relations here at Tokyo International University. And tonight I'll be co-chairing this panel alongside Professor Giorgio Shani, who is a professor of politics and international studies, and also the co-editor of the recent special issue from the Review of International Studies that we'll be discussing this evening. And I would like to extend a very special welcome to all of our guests who are all guests and panelists who have joined us this evening. Now, just one housekeeping note before we begin, and that is that this session is being recorded and will also be made available online. And if you would like to ask questions, please use the question and answer chat box at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I would like to hand over the floor to Professor Giorgio Shani.
Thank you very much, Chris. And it's a great honor and pleasure to be able to co-chair this event with you. I would like to thank you and Masa for your efforts, and also I'd like to thank Professor J.J. Saw from the Social Science Research Institute and Dr. Dilton Ribeiro from the same institute for helping publicize it. And last but not least, the efforts of the British International Studies Association for publicizing this, and particularly Dr. Martin Coward, the lead editor of Review of International Studies, for his support. Now, we are going to be doing IR differently, and we're going to be doing IR differently by focusing on relational cosmologies around the world. What I'll do is to briefly explain the rationale for this event, and to pose one question to all of the participants, who I'll then very briefly introduce. So the rationale, the first rationale, is what happens if we conceive of international relations, IR, in terms of the discipline of international relations, from a relational perspective. And secondly, how can we pluralize the sources of relational thinking in international relations? So these are the two guiding questions which inform, or will hopefully inform, the responses of the participants. So each participant will be asked or posed the question, what are you doing differently? How are you doing IR differently? Okay, key terms. So I'm aware that some of you are undergraduate students, and some of you may not be majoring in international relations. What is international relations? Of course, it is difficult for us to come up with a generic definition. However, international relations can be introduced as a major which looks at relations between ontologically atomistic units, in this sense, sovereign states. Now, relationality or relational international relations challenges these conceptions by prioritizing and looking at relations as prior to and constitutive of entities, things. So in other words, relations before states. We will be focusing also on relational cosmologies and how they challenge international relations. Now, cosmologies can be seen as narratives, more specifically, a set of ontological and epistemological claims about the origins and evolution of the cosmos and our place in it. And as I've argued in a recently co-authored article with Professor Hartman-Baer, they're explicitly normative as well. Now, a pluriverse results from the entanglement from relations between these enmeshed, entangled universes or entangled cosmologies. So these are the some generic understandings of the key terms which the participants may problematize. Now, in terms of the rationale for the participants, all of them contributed to the following publications. The first was a forum on differing about difference, relational international relations from around the world, which was published earlier this year in International Studies Perspectives. Tamara Trownsell and Arlene Tickner were the main editors for this. They wrote the intro and got us together. And subsequently, we have a review of international studies, forthcoming special issue, which is co-edited by Tammy, Navnita, Professor Navnita Behera, and Dr. Anahita Arian and myself on pluriversal relationality. I'm delighted to point out that all of the contributions to the special issue are free to access, and I'll share the link as soon as this slideshow is finished. So on to the participants. We first have Professor Navnita Behera from the University of Delhi in India. She is taking the lead in terms of editing the special issue on pluriversal relationality. And she'll be followed by Dr. Tamara Trownsell, who is co-editor of both the RAS special issue and also the ISP forum with Professor Arlene Tickner. Arlene needs no introduction. She is the International Studies Association Vice President, or a former Vice President, along with Navnita, and is series editor with Professor David Blaney, who also is an important part of the collective of the Worlding Beyond the West series. Arlene will be followed by Dr. Anahita Arian, who has already given a Global Dialogues lecture here, or seminar. Anahita works on Rumi and in particular and in Islam, and she is co-editor of the special issue. Anahita will be followed by Amaya, Dr. Amaya Querejazu from Aberystwyth University, and also is Associate Professor of Antioquia University in Colombia. Amaya has contributed both to the special issue and the ISP forum. Unfortunately, Professor Amelia Kirky could not make it. She suddenly had to cancel, but we have Professor Chih-yu Shih, one of the most eminent scholars in East Asia on international relations, and apparently one of the oldest varsity basketball players. Chih-yu will be followed by Kosuke Shimizu, who is an eminent softball player, who also works on international relations. He's professor at Ryukoku University and has a book on the Kyoto School and International Relations coming out in Arlene's series. And Professor Martin Weber from the University of Queensland. Martin works on international relations theory, particularly in critical and relational theory, but is here in his capacity to talk about Aboriginal or Indigenous Australian international thought. And finally, Dr. Jarrad Reddekop from Carmarthen College, Canada, will join. He was unable to join us, but he has sent a video. Jarrad works on Kichwa relationality and international relations. Okay, before I turn over to Navnita and ask her what she and what we are doing differently, let me make a couple of brief remarks about what we mean by pluriversal relationality. Well, it's based on the assumption that a relational turn is underway in the sciences, and this is reflected in international relations. Usually things are reflected several decades later within international relations. This relational turn brings into question our understandings of ontology. This is specifically brought into question by the contributions of Tammy and Jarrad. And the relational turn, as Navnita and I argue, needs to be provincialized by engaging with different cosmologies. So the special issue engages with different relational cosmologies or relational ontological traditions. So the Indigenous Australian or Aboriginal in Morgan, Mary, and Martin's work, Kichwa relationality with Jarrad. Then we have Amazonian, Andean cosmological traditions with Amaya and Tami, Confucian tradition with Chih-yu, and the concept of the relational cosmology of Dharma with Navnita and I. So the ideas collectively, the different relational cosmologies constitute a pluriverse of entangled universes. And you can see perhaps the clearest articulation of pluriversality in Amaya's contribution. Okay, without further ado, I would like to turn this over to Navnita. So this is a plurilogue. What are we doing differently? Thank you very much.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Professor Lamont and Professor Shani for organizing this. Sure promises to be a really engaging conversation. So what are we doing IR differently, and how did we really get here? I just want to take literally just like a minute of my time to share a little bit of my research journey. That started with basically two questions: that how do you do IR that actually speaks to its constraints, our students, our ground realities? How do you do IR that helps you understand your world, so to say? Because the different parts of the world that we come from, when we draw insights from there, we learn from all these different cosmologies that Professor Giorgio talked about. How do they then speak to IR? Because IR has its own lingua franca, its own, epistemes, its own parameters. So those were the basically two questions from where the journey began, that has brought us to talk about and trying to understand how do we do it differently in a way that the first two goals are sort of amicably met. Speaking for myself, the first part of my journey has been having been trained in Indian university system in realism, to learn that was like, somebody blindfolds you, ties your hand behind your back and puts you in a chessboard and asks you to play on a turf that has been set by somebody else, rules of the game set by somebody else, and you're asked to theorize. You can't, so then I've turned to other more sympathetic, critical theory, feminist IR, other things. And I very quickly learned that all of them, what I call, suffer from the three E's: the problem of Eurocentricism, empiricism, and this premium we put on episteme, the epistemological character of knowledge. That has led us to understand that our very basic social categories, our very basic ways of knowing and understanding our world, our very foundational assumptions are basically so narrow that they don't speak to us, because they primarily draw from one cosmological worldview. And that's why we find it constrictive, ourselves in a very constricted position. So in the special issue, what we different authors have tried to do, and what we also try to do, is actually engage with these issues at a meta-theoretical level and at a metaphysical level to understand the very basic foundational assumptions. And we do that in three ways in terms of turning to what Giorgio interestingly explained as relational IR. The reason it interested me was because it addresses things at an existential level. What he's in describing, that you don't take anything, any reality, as comprising that of the atomistic sort of units. And these units can be anything. These can be individual states, plants, any beings, right? But the relations are, the interconnection sort of comes prior and is constitutive of these entities. The one big thing that has helped me open the doors is it's allowed me to understand difference in a different way. And that's where the collective of, doing IR differently was, I think, born, because IR's main problem is the problem of difference. We understand difference in a very hierarchical manner, and difference is looked at something of a problem that has to be managed, resolved, handled, coped somehow. It has a very sort of a negative orientation because it's understood in a hierarchical sense, that there are different hierarchies of knowledge, there are different modes of knowing, and there are different binaries. The relational IR to me opened the doors, for questioning these binaries and these hierarchies. But what it did also was that it put what we faced is a kind of a quandary. And the quandary is that, notwithstanding sort of this growing interest in non-European cosmological traditions in IR, they all are still struggling to speak to IR. And the reason what we found was that if any particular cosmology is too different from the quote unquote secular cosmology of IR, which at least in our paper we've argued is secularized, but it's primarily Judeo-Christian cosmological assumptions on which it rests. The problem is that if it is very different and you want to speak to it on your terms, you may not even be heard because your parameters, your ways of thinking are very different. So you get either delegitimized or silenced or marginalized or put in a little corner, in a little ghetto where you can do your own thing while IR continues its journey. And if you draw common points, then the onus lies on these different cosmologies to justify how different are you. This has already been said and done by the European IR. So how different are you? What is it, that new thing that you're saying? And it's, I think, this quandary that we face that really sets up the special issue in a way that, it tells us as to how are we trying to make spaces for not just one particular cosmology, but for different cosmological traditions. And I would just take 1 minute to explain as to how we do it by drawing on dharma. We took the 4 major constitutive elements of IR and we kind of sought to turn it around in a bit to provincialize IR. The standard notion of understanding of time, for example, is that of a linear notion. It has a beginning, it has an end. As per dharmic cosmology, we argue that time is not a linear notion of time. Its understanding of time is a heterotemporal understanding of time. Time can be circular, time can be linear, and it intersects at different points of time. So it's not just one linear point. The second and more important was the whole idea of how do you understand self. It's not a bounded self, which is different from the other. The point is the self and other is part. It's like there are no opposites. There is no reality that does not comprise opposites. So the binary between the self and other does not exist in the dharmic cosmology. The basic thing is that you cannot have a relationship which is happy with yourself unless you have a happy relationship with others. So you can't look at other as an evil. You can't hierarchize or binarize your relationship with the other. And the third was the idea of the order. The idea of the order in the Judeo-Christian cosmology is like outside in. The God has ordered the universe into order, right? Anarchy from outside puts the world into order. Dharmic cosmology argues about idea of order inside out. If a human being or any sentient being is at peace with herself, himself, or with its own being, then you are in harmony with the others in your social group, in your society, in your state, in the cosmos, and so on and so forth. So the idea of order is something that emerges from within and not imposed from outside. The basic attempt here in this paper and in the special issue, what we are trying to see is that most of these non-Western cosmologies are actually born out of lived practices of people around the world. And these lived practices speak better because they all abide by relational cosmologies. And that's what we are hoping to sort of invite others to join in this conversation and see how do we IR differently then. I'll pass on the buck.
Thank you, Navnita. Dr. Tamara Trownsell.
Yes, good evening and good morning. These are multiple temporalities that we're dealing with throughout the world. Okay, so I'd like to pick up a little bit on what Navnita was saying to be able to go into my 5 minutes that I am starting right now to make sure I stick to it. The question of doing difference differently, I think the reason why we get into a hierarchical situation is because we're continually using this either or logic, which is based on a particular ontological orientation, which forces us actually ontologically to see the world in terms of either this or that, which means then that we have to translate these things or these options hierarchically to be able to figure out what is best and what is not. And so specifically what Navnita was talking to, I was just talking about yesterday in class, is that what happens when you pluralize your ontological register and you're able to use a different logic that helps you to understand this both and understanding, which is precisely what Navnita was discussing about the self and other, right? So it's totally integrated. And in that sense, when you're thinking in both and terms, you are not needing to marginalize, to extricate, to exterminate the other. You have to figure out how to engage the other in a way that's more constructive, or to harmonize yourself and other, understanding that yourself is not self without the other, etc. So I think this is a really important challenge. And I think this gets to a little bit, this is a repeated theme throughout the special issue and the entire team of authors. I think all of us touch on this in one way or the other. So I think that that's a great way to start discussing how we do IR differently, is to invite everyone to look at what are the ways in which we as scholars are utilizing a particular register that we've inherited without necessarily allowing ourselves to explore. And that's exactly what these other cosmologies force us to do. So in my particular case, after living 17 years in Ecuador, living in the highlands and in the Andes, I was exposed to a lot of different relational ideas. And it's very much just like what Navnita says. So my understanding of robust relationality came through my experience of these Andean cosmovivencias, is what they would say. And this is not to mean, though, and this is very important also, that I, as a white woman from the global north, come down, mine this knowledge, and then take it back to the north to then sort of say, okay, I'm applying this. Instead, this both and logic, what it forces us to do is to reckon how it is that we are ontologically constituted, where that comes from, how it affects us, and how these other logics derive from other ways of understanding existence, right? And so more it's about building bridges and about, first of all, deeply understanding where you're coming from, your own programming, and then by being able to explain where other people's programming comes from, you can start to create and generate these bridges. So in fact, at least my article in the Review of International Studies is focused primarily on how and why do we need to pluralize the ontological register that we use within international relations. And so this is very much so that we can start to be more inclusive and sit in tension with different others, right? So we need to take on this both and understanding of the world. And this is how doing IR differently would happen, is that we don't feel like it's always constantly a game of a hierarchical game of domination. So, and this is my last point that will take just 1 minute. I think that one of my goals is that in order to face the complexity of today, it's really important to generate multidimensional tools, right? And this part of this process of developing multidimensional tools is learning to become comfortable with being uncomfortable ontologically, existentially, which obviously when you look outside and you look at the world today, we don't need any extra stimulation by a professor to be doing this. I mean, you already have a lot of external stimuli telling you that you need to learn how to be existentially uncomfortable. So I guess the challenge then is, how do you teach these tools that allows students to understand that every single challenge global challenge that we're facing today in world politics and in life in general can be looked at through many optics. And if we have multiple logics with which we're able to engage the different challenges, then we're going to be able to be more resilient with these challenges. And I think that this is something that I find to be really important. The only real challenge, and this is, part of the reality of moving back to the United States, is that you start to see a lot of people are at wit's end in terms of their nerves. And so to talk about being multidimensional is almost like striking people's nerves. And so you have to, the amount of resistance that one can face, which is very much like the IR discipline that Navnita was alluding to, becomes even more daunting of a challenge. But I think it's really important that this complexity and our ease with engaging complexity really be one of our goals, because otherwise, we're pretty much going to see ourselves, in becoming obsolescent is how I see it. But anyway, or obsolete, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tammy. Arlene?
Thank you, Giorgio. And I just want to thank everyone who's participated in the organization of this wonderful gathering, which hopefully will be in person sometime in the future. I did not participate in the special issue of the Review of International Studies. I have been active in this project. And I want to try to complement what Navnita and Tammy have already said. Since most of us have arrived quite recently, with the exclusion perhaps of Tammy and Chih-yu, at the language of relationality, relational perspectives, pluriversality, and whatnot, I thought I would take a step back from this specific discussion, to which I don't know how much more I have to add, given the wonderful interventions already made, to try to think out loud about how and why I've been doing IR differently, and the ways in which this ultimately has led me to questions of ontology and relationality. And I think I might start by recognizing that beyond the growing bodies of literature, some of which Giorgio has already spoken about, outside of IR primarily, that have concerned themselves with the politics of ontology, it's thanks to many of those present in this webinar that my own curiosity was initially sparked. And I just want to gesture to David Blaney, who I saw in the audience connected, to give a special word of thanks to him, because much of this journey has been done with all of you and with him. I want to make a brief note about my own positionality, as everyone else has done, quite interestingly. And hopefully Kosuke and Chih-yu will talk to us about how sports has also played into their approaches to IR. In my specific case, I also am a US-born woman, white, who's been living in Colombia for 35 years, a little bit more. I have little to no formal training in international relations. I did a PhD, of course, because I had to at some point, but under a situation of tremendous duress with two small babies. I was a professor of international relations before actually studying the subject matter. And I would also say that I have little training formally in research methods and theory. And so in my specific case, I think my curiosity and research agenda have been driven more by my situatedness than the need to contribute or attach myself to existing disciplinary debates. And I see this as a plus in this case, because I think it's been quite liberating not to be disciplined and not to be schooled in the canons of international relations. Now, in my particular case, given my situatedness in Colombia and Latin America, I started by thinking about Latin America and IR in terms of intellectual hegemony. And this led to me doing my PhD dissertation on the state of IR in the region, where I ultimately picked up on, a series of Latin American concepts, which I thought, could be viewed as alternative contributions to debates on key concepts in the field. And this kind of slowly but surely led to me thinking more about the third world or the global south and their contributions to rethinking categories and concepts prevalent within the field. And yet, as this journey ensued, I started seeing on my own and with colleagues such as David, that within IR discipline, logics of saming, taming, and disciplining lent themselves to writing alternative registers of the global and the international out of the narrative. That is, those alternative concepts that actually fit were much more similar to what IR was looking for than others that didn't. And so this, in combination just with thinking about how the intellectual division of labor plays out in our field and others to create core periphery logics, kind of let me think about, how in areas such as Latin America, IR kind of ensues within the limits of the discipline in a way that we constantly feel the need to fit in, to contribute, and we somehow become dependent on the fads going on in the discipline. And I see this happening, with current debates on plurality and global IR. At the same time that these gesture to alternatives, allegedly seek out to recognize these alternatives being offered outside of the core, they also play a key role in saming and taming and disciplining. And so essentially, this has kind of led me to think this is not just a problem of how we represent the world, that is issues of epistemology, but also one of ontology. So I have 10 seconds. I just wanted to say that this is kind of where my thinking is going. And yet, and this is where I'm going to end, when we ask ourselves how to pluralize the field or how to pluralize specifically approaches to relationality, this is kind of where I've come up against a wall that I'd like to share. In my specific case, given that many, if not most, relational cosmo-livings or cosmovivencias in my part of the world are practiced by ancestral, indigenous, and rural communities, I increasingly feel that I can't continue to talk or write about this without greater engagement, collaboration, and work with those communities. I do think that there's a risk, again, of ontological capture and re-hierarchization that we are all eventually falling into. And this, at least in my case, has led me to think that unless we're willing also to start working with those communities and collaborating with those communities with an eye to co-producing knowledge, then we're really also not doing robust relationality, at least in a meaningful sense to me. And that's where I will end. I went over my time, sorry.
Thank you very much, Arlene. Anahita?
Thank you, Giorgio. I will just pick up where Arlene left about her own background and how she navigates through these questions. For me, it has always been evident that I am different, but it's been related to the fact that I was born into a war, so international relations somehow was ultimately going to cross my path. And I grew up in a war between Iran and Iraq. And at the age of 8, we fled. So I was also, as a child, a refugee. And then I grew up in the Netherlands. So that part of the world also ultimately formed me. So I have my Iranian background and I have my Dutch background. And at the same time, growing up in the Netherlands, I also experienced these tendencies of assimilation, right? So what is going on in IR is actually something that has been replayed throughout my life, that you have to assimilate, that you cannot be and this and that. And growing up, this question was always asked, are you Dutch or are you Iranian? So I've always been confronted with this either or logic and never felt very comfortable for it because frankly, I'm not either this and I'm not this either. I am both. So this is how I do IR different through a lived experience that both and has existed throughout my own existence and will continue to do so. And when studying, I also lived for a while in the United States and in other countries. And these experiences have also formed me, obviously, and became a part of me. So I think doing IR differently for me is very intuitive, in the sense that it's mostly based on experience itself in life. And in terms of like the formal part of doing it academically, it's mostly bringing out the sources, the histories, the narratives and stories of people that have been basically obscured or neglected, negated, because they're basically not fitting into that assimilationist frame. So I've personally tried to always fight in my life this tendency to assimilation. And on the other hand, I try to do the same thing in IR by highlighting those voices that have basically, been erased or been basically repressed mostly. And this draws in the Islamic world, because that is where I'm from and very much familiar with, but also the Western world, or Europe more broadly, because I'm a product of both of these worlds. And doing IR differently for me is not only showing the differences between these two worlds, but mostly also showing how they're very much entangled and how they have influenced each other throughout centuries and will continue to do so, although both sides have the tendency to negate this aspect in different ways. So for me, this is doing IR differently, trying to show those entanglements, trying to show those hybridities intellectually, culturally, philosophically, and most important of all, historically. Now, I'm making a small contribution to the special issue, and next to that, I'm working on my own paper on relationality, which deals with aspects of how a relationality is viewed through an Islamic lens and Islamic cosmologies, and how that talks back to IR. And so I've been working through that, and it has been very great to be part of this collective, because I've learned also so much and have also seen some parallels, particularly between certain concepts of Buddhism and Sufism on the one hand, and on the other hand, this concept of relationality also exists in the Western world. It has been mostly negated and silenced. This is also important to say. This story is there as well, right? So you have Spinoza with his monist philosophy that comes very, very close to other philosophies that are also relational. So IR has not only done a disservice to the rest of the world, but also to its own cultural heritage of what it claims to come from. And this constitutes that world. I also try to bring that out in my work, and will continue to do so for years to come, until the moment that IR finally wakes up out of this assimilationist slumber and realizes that it's not a very useful path, or a path that will speak to the majority of the world itself.
Thank you very much, Anahita. Perfect timing. Amaya?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. For me, it's very, very nice to see you, all the familiar faces, and join you and share with you this space. It's kind of like being part of a cosmological family by now. Anyway, so if I had to reply to the first question of what or how IR relational perspectives changes IR, I would say that it changes everything. It disrupts everything. And every notion, every category, every assumption is going to come differently. And conflict, climate change, security, everything shifts. And when you change the rules of the game in a discipline such as IR, then you have to provide with some answers. And the answers that sometimes relationality offers is about constant becoming, uncertainty, incommensurability, self and other. And these, of course, are not easy to navigate, even, or especially if you have been, or we have been socializing in disciplines that are about categories and producing knowledge and systematizing and embracing truths. So how do I do international relations differently? I have to say that I always loved learning political theory and philosophy. But when it came to the point when I had to address specific issues of my context, being born and raised in Bolivia and South America, and then living the rest of my life in Colombia and South America, then this also needed other ways of engaging, because, okay, Mearsheimer's walls, neorealism, okay, they are interesting, but what do they mean? How do you make sense of this? So then by shifting the question of, okay, well, how do we make sense of being in and with the world? Then when you start asking that question, then you don't find easy answers in IR. And somebody once said to me that was not from the academia. He said, "Okay, if you want to find answers about how to make sense of the world or something more meaningful, then you go to myths and beliefs and spiritual narratives of things, but you don't use knowledge or hard theory or mainstream theory to make sense, because what is make sense at all?" So what I have found is like I used Andean cosmology because it was the most familiar to me. I have always been like knowing it and that it existed. I could find examples of Andean relationality in my context. But what I now, after these years of doing research with relational and using relational cosmologies, what I found is like it resonates with many other cosmologies throughout the world. Not only that, but also what I have learned is that with this collective of doing IR differently, that we have worked so much on difference, is that Andean cosmology has taught me to embrace difference and living in the tension. So living in the tension is the standpoint where you stay and try to do these kind of exercises of sense making of the world. So basically, relationality is not evident. It's not evident when we have been either socialized or the politics of forgetting or the politics of suppressing relationality are very evident. That is why I like the idea of latency so much, because latency gives the idea that it's always there and it has been there. And what Tammy and Anahita were saying, that we have the sensibilities, it comes as intuition, is very important for me, because what I see is like, what I wanted to do with my work is that it's not about Western, non-Western, or indigenous, non-indigenous. As Navnita was saying, these are lived experience. And as beings, we all experience life. So we all have the sensibilities, the skills of living in the tension or being in relationality. But we need to unlearn and learn again. And in this takes practice. It's not easy. It takes practice because it's about constantly fighting and contesting your own beliefs and your own assumptions. And this is not easy. So that is why I wanted to do it in the paper of published in the special issue. I wanted to highlight the fact that through experience and through practice, it's not about, okay, indigenous cosmologists are more aware of this because they practice every day. They have done much more efforts to remember it or not to forget. But it doesn't mean that it's not a practice that everybody can do. So what I did is like to try to enable these kind of skills that as beings we all have to enhance the idea of the experience of living relationality. And and this means also not only unlearning, but also a lot of letting go. Let go. Stop trying to control. Stop trying to achieve truths. And if it's something appears to be weird and if something appears to be odd, then embrace it. Embrace it, stand up there and try to learn from there. And this, of course, will trigger some other sensibilities that are key for me, that are not about theorizing or rationalization or those more traditional ways of achieving knowledge. It's about enabling the creative and the imaginative part of ourselves. And those things help to understand how relationality changes everything. And to finish, I will also say that, of course, it's not easy. And how does it feel to do IR differently? So most of the times it feels like Don Quixote fighting the windmills, because it's so powerful, the walls and the structures that you are fighting against, fighting in the relational kind of way, like in the I don't know, creative kind of way. But the windmills are very heavy and they are very there. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Amaya. Chih-yu?
Oh, thank you very much. I think I'll go directly into the question how I've been doing IR differently. First of all, I have to confess that I don't know how I do IR differently because I cannot do things consistently. I realize that hegemonic control has always been very flexible. They're always trying to adapt and change the way they control. So to resist, I cannot remain consistent. So I go back to myself in the past and I realize I've changed over time. Sometimes I've changed the way I do things, but not realize that. And then after a while, I actually go back to my earlier period without realizing that. Only after so much changes, and I go back and I see myself being in such an inconsistent way. But fortunately, the Confucius once give us advice that you don't need to be consistent in values or institution. You only need to be faithful and tolerant to whoever you're dealing with. So that's a very good advice. But coming to values and institution, I think I do have an interest in tracing the cosmological origin of contemporary values and institutions and believing that the disposition that people who live in the contemporary world come actually from that cosmological origin, maybe thousands of years ago, but people could not feel it. It's not even expressible. So I do have an interest in tracing this cosmological origin. And in fact, Confucius once said that he was faithful only to the ancient wisdom. He doesn't trust anything today. And thirdly, I think important thing for me is to accept the fact that all relational cosmology has a natural tendency to expand because no cosmology can continue allowing strangers to living outside what your cosmology considers to be natural. So there is a natural tendency to expand. So it's important to see how two different relational cosmology encounter each other and interact. And Confucius actually said that there is a shared spirit in everything. What he actually said is that since everyone is different, everything is different, in order to understand yourself, you really have to be related to all those different things in order to feel the spirit that everyone shares. In that regards, I think it's important to show appreciation. That's my first point. It's important to show appreciation for anyone who's willing to unlearn their own past in order to accommodate me into their relational system, even though they're accommodating me in a way that I don't appreciate, but I still have to appreciate that they're trying to be nice to me and trying to understand my existence. And in order to assist them, I should also try to unlearn myself. And this is what Confucius says, to embrace virtue with virtue. And the fifth point I want to make, I think it's important for us to learn how two relational systems encounter and expand and coexist by looking at bilingual population and also looking at those communities living on borders, any borders, religious borders, social borders, cultural borders. I think those people, their actual daily life teach us a lot about how to coexist and expand without conquering each other. Finally, I want to say that relationality, relational cosmology, or study of it does not really represent anything beautiful. It can be very ugly, and we have to remember that. And the coexistence can be non-peaceful. So we have to remember that it's not that we mean good, it always come out good. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Chih-yu. Kosuke?
Thanks very much. And I'm Kosuke Shimizu from Ryukyu University. And I don't want to give you an impression that all those Asian men go everywhere, but actually I don't know where I'm heading for at the moment. And I'm not sure what I have done in the past. So I too go everywhere and pretty much inconsistent. But one thing which really strikes me in engaging with doing IR different collective is that I've got slightly different angle about relationality itself. It's probably because I'm from Japan. I was born in Japan and grown up here. And I did my postgraduate studies abroad, but came back here. And basically, I'm having this tough time with relational culture, kind of based upon Confucianism, partly because my mom is a hardcore left-wing feminist, and she was single mother, and I spent a long time with her alone. So some kind of feeling against this Confucian society is ingrained in myself, and I just can't ignore it. And so I have a little bit different from Chih-yu in that sense. I'm quite against Confucianism, I'm sorry to tell you. But the thing is, Chih-yu's Confucianism is really sort of idealistic or kind of abstract idea of Confucianism. And I experienced all those oppressions and, based upon Confucianism. And that's the reason why I'm up against it. And as to the question how I proceed this relational approach to international relations, I actually started my engagement with Kyoto School of Philosophy. That was simply because it was something cool. I thought in the first place, it's simply as simple as that. And then I get into it, and I found it is absolutely beautiful, based upon Buddhist philosophy, and it promotes idea of particular type of relationality, which is also originated from Buddhism. It's called engi. It's a spontaneous temporal relationality. Relationality doesn't have any essence. Relationality is flowing everywhere. It happens everywhere. It's contingency. It's a representation of contingency, and I thought it's beautiful. But question just came up that despite this beauty of Kyoto School of Philosophy, they were involved in the imperialist government during the war. My question is why? So since then, my inquiry into relationality was actually to dig in the deep, dark side of relationality. And then I because I'm working at Ryukoku University, which is founded by the biggest temple of Japan, and the first year student has to take this class called Buddhist Thought. It's a compulsory class. So it's a really Buddhist university, and as a result, I've been associated with all those Buddhist specialists and the monks and all that. And I was invited to some Buddhist ideas. Now I became the director of the Center of World Buddhist Cultures in this university. And then I found again, Buddhist temples were involved in imperialism too. So the question is why? Why? Buddhism is a beautiful relational ideas, but they came to deeply associated with imperialist government, and they actually exercise violence against people living in the former colonial nations. So that's what I've been working on, and so you can't expect me to talk a lot about beautiful side of relationality. But if you're interested in dark side of it, I would tell you what I've got. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kosuke. And Martin, so next Martin, thank you.
Hello, thank you. I speak to you from the lens of the Jagera and Toribul people, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging as is custom here. But this is also part of what our piece in the Review of International Studies is about. I would like to, introduce this by saying I have the luxury of not speaking for myself. The other two couldn't be here. It would have been nice if they could. It would have made it complicated. But I am here to channel what it is that you can expect when you encounter the piece that we produced. Maybe a little bit on the history. So what are we doing differently? What are we? And the first thing is, we really didn't set out to do IR. And we really didn't care very much about IR, the discipline. We were interested in international relations. We should have maybe said small I, small r. These are the kinds of things. We were interested in politics, in political institutions. And what we had was a conversation in many different forms and different forums, the three of us and with other people involved over something like 7 years that led up to the piece that we ended up producing in order to lift the lid a little bit on seeing why it is, for instance, both instructive and interesting to encounter Aboriginal Australian political ordering as a long-term experiment, very long-term experiment in making politics work and getting political institutions and ordering things up that deal precisely with some of the dark stuff that we've just heard about. There is nothing too, relationalism is not something that is necessarily naive about the dark side of things, and not in the Aboriginal Australian frame. Yet we have a series of achievements in this particular frame that over tens of thousands of years established ways of conducting all the things that we know in IR, wars, conflicts, but for instance, wars without territorial takeovers, right? A whole series of achievements in which law is enacted and lawful action happens in conflict and in all sorts of things that are exactly the stuff that we think international relations is made about, in which this very, very long-term experiment in being human in the world in political forms disclosed things to us as we were kind of reconstructing it, because it is a retrieval effort for Aboriginal Australian people to some extent too, coming in out under from colonialism and the impact or the horrifying impact of what Mary, who is now not here, but would call the survivalist ethos of the Westerners who arrived in Australia. The survivalist ethos, I can just as a throwaway, I would impress on all of you to think about that as very closely linked to the existentialist frame that has been raising its head in all the presentations every now and again, right? It's something that's extremely seductive in a number of different ways. It is there, it's to be reckoned with, it's a human, it's part of being human. Aboriginal Australians know this, but it's also the part that needs to be managed into place. It's the part that needs to be kept in check through law, through political institutions and all that. So that's been the interest behind what we've been writing. And this is one reason why we don't come down, advocating for massive explorations in ontology or something like that. Not because they are not interesting and not because that's not a pursuit, but because ontology forces us to adopt a certain kind of language to talk about those kinds of things. So what we did, the three of us, we were performing relationally, right, in trying to get a relational story about international relations up and into that journal. That was the idea. We didn't write it as a dialogue. Maybe we should have. We talked about that at various stages, that that's a possibility. But that would have been wrong as well, because the entanglement is other, right? We're in each other's backyards here and everything else, and we need to work this out. And to work this out is to find political institutions to make it work. And that was the part that we were interested in. What is there to be learned from each other and everything else, but not as external things. These are all present in each other's categories and each other's lives already in complicated and sometimes really confounding ways. But to bring that out was really the kind of idea of trying to make relational thinking part of the architecture of the approach to the project itself. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. And this speaks perfectly to our final presentation by Jarrad. Unfortunately, Jarrad cannot be here, but I believe that his video will now be played. It's exactly 5 minutes long. Thank you.
Yes, here is Jarrad's video.
Okay, hi everyone. So my name is Jarrad Reddekop, and I'm going to be speaking about a couple of pieces that I have out, kind of in connection with the Doing IR Differently kind of in connection with the Doing IR Differently collective. So the first of those is the Why Runa piece that I have in the ISP forum, Differing About Difference. And then the second one being the Against Ontological Capture article that I have coming out in the forthcoming special issue in Review of International Studies, but it's also available now in first view, I believe. So I'd like to start first of all by thanking the organizers for making this event happen and express my regrets I can't be there live, as it were, but I'm grateful that I can contribute a few words in this way. So if I'm going to answer the question, I guess, of how I'm doing IR differently, or at least trying to do IR differently, first of all, what I'm doing is I'm in both of those pieces. I'm trying to take my orientation from ontological and cosmological traditions outside of the West. So in particular, Amazonian Quechua thinking, but also more broadly, indigenous American thinking more broadly, noting that comprises quite a diversity, but also there's a number of interresonances and so on. And so I'm trying to take my cue from thinking with these traditions in order to think through some of the implications and entailments of what it might mean to think and live and practice existence in a relational way on the basis of relational ontological assumptions and cosmological traditions and so on. Now I'm trying to think this through in particular in relation to a number of core kind of problematics, practices, concepts, and so on that are central to IR, and that if they participate in similar problematics, I'm trying to think through the ways in which nonetheless what they lead to, the ways in which then those problematics get resolved, get responded to, and so on, lead somewhere quite different, and in ways that hopefully open up different kinds of horizons of possibility for contemporary practice and the creation of different kinds of relations and futures and so on. So some of these key problematics I'm thinking about here are, for example, how is it possible or meaningful to relate to others or relate with others across boundaries of difference? How is it possible to think about and practice the constitution of communities and of political and legal space? What are some of the normative tools and orientations that might be connected to this kind of construal of a relational space-time? And a key aspect of this that I'm trying to think through in particular is the way in which Quechua relational thinking allows for something that's quite different from the sort of anthropocentrism that we're used to, inherited from the sort of Eurocentric tradition and gets written to dominant IR as a foundational assumption. So in particular, the ways in which the term for human, for example, Runa, is something that also applies to other beings, so plants and animals and so on. This then creates a different kind of relational space where relations across difference include relations with the land and with territory, and then can include other human beings by an extension of similar modes of relating. So principles can apply from one case to the other in some sense. And another core part of this is this idea that normativity and law then in some sense is emergent from territory, the kinds of relations that comprise and compose territory and are modeled by the beings themselves, the non-human beings in relation to one another. So part of what I'm trying to do here then is there's an aspect here of provincializing and defamiliarizing, of course, core concepts and building blocks of dominant IR. I mean, there's a descriptive value to what I'm doing here, insofar as I think it's necessary to understand some of this stuff in order to understand contemporary indigenous politics. But moreover, part of what I'm trying to do here is asking how, in thinking these things through in this way, how does this open the door to different ways of practicing politics in the contemporary moment? I try to connect this in through the mechanism of treaty and the way in which North American indigenous peoples have written about treaty and thought about treaty and so on. I try and connect this to the same kinds of relational principles we see emergent in the Amazonian context to try and draw out some lessons for how might a positionality such as myself, which is that of a non-Indigenous person, nonetheless be interpolated into a different way of practicing politics, of being relational in a just way, and so on. That hopefully it exceeds quite substantially the ways in which these questions are usually hashed out in more dominant ways. So that's my time. Thanks.
Hey, thank you very much to all the contributors for sharing their views on how, or the responses to the question of how they're doing IR differently. We have 20 minutes for question and answer. I believe we have 3 questions which have already been posed in the question and answer box, and also another question, Eloise, I think you posted it in chat. Shall we take the questions in order? Would anyone like to respond to the first question? So the question is, how can relational cosmologies change our conception of security and conflict resolution? I can very briefly respond. Are there any other people who would like to jump in? So I mean, perhaps I can also bring in Navnita on this, but our understanding of security, particularly within security studies within the discipline of international relations, is based on a concept of protection, a protection which comes from an external actor, what may be called a secularized, transcendent creator. So the key question here is, how does security translate, or does security translate into different cosmological registers? And following up on the idea of conflict resolution, the idea that conflicts can be resolved rather than transformed is itself something which is prefaced on a certain cosmological thinking or foundational ideas that solutions are possible, which may not be prevalent in different cosmological registers. Anyone else like to speak on security before we look at emancipation, which I think Martin has replied to this already. Martin?
Oh, just a quick one. I mean, I just want to remind you of the brief vignette I put in there about the management of war and peace and lawful conduct, and the ability to have conflicts, including conflicts involving violence and all the rest of it, but within a rules-governed international system. I think there's enough to be curious about there, how something like that could be done, and what that means for the kind of ways in which we dominantly think about legitimate institutions and what they're supposed to be performing. That's just a series of possibilities to think about clearly conflict resolution and the questions of security.
And perhaps if you can continue on to your response to the question on emancipation, which Samantha.
Oh, sorry. I mean, I don't
Okay.
want to take too much time. I've written an answer, and
Sure.
I hope that helped. This is a difficult one. It could take us all evening to unpack this, right? But I mean, the simple thing is, historically, there has been what we can describe as emancipation in various different forms in various different places. Try and figure out what they were. Don't think of it as a resultative thing. There's not going to be one blissful state when everyone is emancipated and we are all this is all far too escapist, right? I mean, they're looking at a redemptive frame of politics again. And while that may be attractive in people's personal lives, I don't think this is the interpolity challenge that we face. Making things better definitely is a challenge. And there's a lot of things that we can do that can reduce relations of domination, for instance, and all that. And that's been going on, and there are good examples of all of that. Critical theory isn't, describing a utopian end state. It's actually querying what is going wrong in this attempt to totalize things that are actually problematic. And it's raising those kinds of issues if you want to tie it to the critical theory frame. So I'll just put that hat on for a second. It's not the one I'm wearing for the whole evening.
Thank you very much, Martin. Anyone else like to focus on emancipation before we move on? Amaya?
Yes, thank you. I find that that is a very important question or concern about relationality, because just a week ago I was seeing a presentation where they basically show, or the argument is that relationality can be uncanny and kind of a way of not emancipating or trapping you in the relations. Like you are so embedded in the relations that you become the mesh and you become and disappear. And that can bring to another idea of totality, where relations are all over the place, that it becomes another way of understanding totality. And this can be problematic too. So what I want to say is that as how I see it, and probably most of you from your work, is that relationality is not good nor bad. And that is the point. So relationality can bring unexpected results that we can qualify as good or bad, as emancipatory or not. But as in my experience, it has been emancipatory because of what it enables. It enables other worlds, it enables other languages, it enables the shifting of standing points and other ways of thinking. So it expands our way of thinking, but doesn't necessarily, it's not a universal emancipation, if you know what I'm meaning here. And it doesn't necessarily respond to logic or structures of power. It depends. It's always going to be dependent on the context because it's relationality. But it's something that I wanted to say, that it's something that the idea of emancipatory or not, it depends on the relations we are talking about and where are we standing. So we cannot have like these generalizations about emancipation. It can be emancipatory, but not necessarily always and forever.
And Arlene, you also had your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to something that Tammy mentioned at the end. I mean, when I think, it depends what type of global emancipation we're talking about. And so just picking up on her comment that the world the cosmos faces a profound existential crisis today that we can't simply continue sidestepping and ignoring. When I think of emancipation, I think of strategies to be able to live, not just humans, but non-humans together in a way that we don't continue, reproducing actions and forms of domination and exploitation that inevitably, now it's a fact, are leading us to our own demise. And in this sense, I think that different forms of relationality actually do lend themselves to thinking about how to exist in and with the cosmos in a different way. Just when we think about codependence, relations of parity, caring, etc., I think all of these are comprised an ethos that actually do feed into a form of emancipation globally that I would actually defend, given the current planetary crisis that we're now seeing.
Thank you, Arlene. I just would like to briefly gesture to my own sort of answer with Hartmut on the issue of emancipation. I think Hartmut shared the link in chat, but moving on to Bryony's question, perhaps Arlene, you'd like to answer this, but it's for the whole panel, but speaks to Arlene's comments about the need to work with indigenous communities in order to co-produce knowledge. Are there particular methodologies that lend themselves to doing IR differently?
Do you want, I can say a quick word. Bryony
you.
mentioned participatory action research. I just want to, in my rethinking of where that type of strategy comes from, I've tried with Amaya actually to trace it to liberation theology, pedagogy, and methodology. And so indeed, I think if you look at participatory action research in its inception, perhaps not in its popularity and widespread use today, including by international institutions, it is actually an interesting starting point for working with different communities on a level playing field. I think also standpoint methodology, which has been developed mostly by feminist circles, is another way of going about thinking through how we do this in ways that are respectful of the knowledges of those about whom we're talking and with whom we're collaborating. And yet, if we add to this kind of the relational layer, I think our relational disposition actually complements quite nicely these other methodological strategies. That's all that I could say.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment? Tammy, I think you were writing an answer at the time, or?
Yes, actually, I just decided to
Thanks.
put my hand up because I didn't realize you were getting to the question. My response to that question is, I want to raise a flag in the sense of the potential of this turning into an anthropocentric endeavor, and how it can also lead us to be categorically predetermined before we start the research. So that's something that I feel very strongly with my own experience, that yes, there are Indigenous communities that do need help and do need collaboration, et cetera. And I get where Arlene's coming from. I just feel like it depends. And I also understand very well what Martin is saying about this existential crisis. I just mean in terms of today, one of the things that I do agree, especially with what Arlene's saying, is that we need to come up with strategies for engaging different groups. And that does mean conversation. So there are several books in participatory research from the late 90s, though, that talk about the tyrannies of participatory action research, which would be really interesting to look at. And also just to put in one more thing to say, we need to take this beyond an anthropocentric lens of looking at just communities and defining those communities as being purely Indigenous or purely relational versus others. I think that exactly, Anahita, you have your hand up. One of the things that we need to think about is exactly what Chih-yu and Anahita were talking about, is these places where there's both and. There are white people and Indigenous people that are working on these issues. And that does not get to your question about methodology. It was just a flag. Thank you.
Anahita?
Yes, thank you, Giorgio. Brioni, it's so nice that you're here. I would want to advise you to have a look at the literature in anthropology, because that could probably help you, since anthropologists have been doing this type of work for so many years, and there has been so many developments, also very progressive ones in anthropology, of how to be together with and how to do together with. So I don't think IR is necessarily going to help you a lot in this endeavor, but I think anthropology probably will.
What if we haven't experienced destitution? Can we understand it? Any responses?
I mean, I think I'm sorry, go ahead, Anahita. Go ahead.
I think it's a very important question, because once you have experienced that, you start to see the world very differently, I think, than from someone that hasn't experienced that destitution. But I also think that those that haven't experienced it would have the capacity to at least imagine what it must be like. And this then really ultimately depends upon the person in question who hasn't experienced it, because I think at some level we all experience some form of destitution in life. The degrees differ, so to say. They can range from basically the survival ethos that Martin was talking about, to perhaps maybe my own experience of as a child growing up in a war, to other forms of destitution or loss, like losing a parent on a very young age, growing up without it. So we all experience some forms of destitution. But I think the key is that the worst forms or the most extreme cases, which include war, hunger, loss of life of parents, colonization, annihilation of a particular culture that you have been living in or that you were raised in. And there are tons of examples of that, right? Even in contemporary times right now. Then obviously that's going to definitely form how you not only see the world, but also how you see other people. But I still think that even if you haven't had experienced those worst forms all at the same time, we, by virtue of being human, still would have the capacity to empathize with a person who has done that. You might not know exactly what it is, but you can have an imagination of what it must be like if you tap deeply into your feelings and in your sense of empathy.
Giorgio, can I come in here?
Go ahead, Navnita.
Sorry, may I? Yeah, I mean, I agree with Anahita. I was going to try and take a look at it from, the kind of work that we're talking about in the dharmic relational cosmology. You do not have to necessarily experience it only to be able to understand it, because the point is, if you and the destitute person are not being analytically considered to be apart, you're not apart. In a ontological, in a being sense, in a sense of your being, then yes, because your being, as per dharmic relational cosmology, cannot be in a happy state if you are with a person in a state of destitution, because the other is also part of you. Now, I understand it's an abstract sense, but this is something precisely what we are talking about when we experience and have lived sort of those practices, because whether it's an individual, whether it is any sentient being, whether it is a social group, or whether it's a part of a society, if you do not consider the other to be an other, then yes, it is possible for you to understand and be able to do something about that destitution of sort of an ontologically other being. You don't just look at it and try to understand it, you do something about it, because you are not at peace with your being, with other person or other being in a state of destitution. So yeah, a quick answer would be that yes, it is possible for us to understand, and more importantly, to do something about it. I would take it at a level of a action and not just leave it at a level of understanding. But if I may, I just wanted to pick on one question, because it's asked by an undergrad student as a how undergrad students can do IR differently. I mean, one thing that I would say, going back on Arlene's comments too also, and I tell my students also, that I think it's about time when we learn something from our field, we should not filter that through our knowledge categories, because the knowledge categories that we get through our books, through our disciplines, through our social scientific tools are actually very limiting. And when we try and filter through these, what we are picking up from the ground, we are actually doing a disservice to the people that we're trying to understand. We are also trying to do a disservice to the discipline. So, how you can do IR differently from wherever you are is have ears to the ground, work with those people, learn from those people, and learn to speak back to the field, rather than filtering your own experiences and your own lived realities and trying to understand them through a fixed basket of knowledge categories. I think that is what many of us grapple with, and it's a conscious call that you got to take to let the field speak for itself. That's what we're saying. Let these different cosmologies speak to IR on their own terms, rather than having to fit themselves in, make themselves intelligible, because that's where, going back to Jarrad, you risk running into a situation of an ontological capture. The moment you're made intelligible, your core, your sacred element is gone, because you've reduced yourself to be understood, which also goes back to speak to the kind of quandary that I was talking about. On whose terms are we willing to listen and understand and speak to these different cosmological traditions? Thank you for that chance.
Okay, thank you, Navnita. We have a lot of questions and only about a minute left. So would anyone like to reply to, obviously type your answers, but reply to any questions which are being posed? There's one about gender, another about religion, on ideas of tradition. Any final comments from the audience?
Is there a way to answer these questions outside this session and we can respond to, because there are a lot of students out there. I would love to respond to some of them, but I don't know whether it's technically feasible or not.
You can share your email address. Your email address is on the RIS special issue papers. So I would like to encourage all those in the audience to, again, read the papers which have been shared, and to contact us if you have other questions. Kosuke, you seem to want to have the last word.
Yeah, just a quick intervention. There was a question about Kyoto School and how Engi relationality actually worked for incorporation with imperialism. The key is, to me, relationality is a process. It is not a special noun. It is not a noun, but it is a process, and it's moving. It's a verb. So relationality always changes, and that actually involves Pablo's question about temporality. So relationality always involves temporality, because it is a process. If it's fixed, and that is problematic to me. So that's my answer to the question about Kyoto School. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to thank the participants for responding to the questions, and to you all for your questions. Apologies that we did not have time to answer all the questions, but again, if you would like to contact us, our details can be found in the papers for the special issue. And I'd like to conclude by also thanking Chris for this great opportunity for all of us to get together and do IR differently. And the key question is, if we're doing IR differently, as Hartmut mentioned, are we still doing IR? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Giorgio, and thank you as well to all the panelists and everybody attending. And likewise, for those students who still have questions, we'll be able to talk about this in the coming days. And also, please feel free to email the speakers as well to continue these conversations. So thank you so much. And with that, we'll be concluding today's webinar.